Welcome to Economics and Beyond. I'm Rob Johnson, president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with my friend Ed Pavlic. He's the Distinguished Research Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Georgia. He's got a number of just superb books and books of poetry. His latest, which just came out, I think a matter of 2 or 3 weeks ago, is called Let It Be Broke. And I will tell you, and I said to him at the in our background discussion, the first poem in that book almost broke me. It was just so powerful about race in America. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay. Ed has also been a major scholar, deep dive on the life and mind of James Baldwin. Ed, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, man, always a pleasure, Robert. Great to be with you.
Well, how would I say? I look at your writings and I don't even know where to begin, but let's just begin. There's a pandemic. There's a world. You're an artist and you're a scholar. What do you see in your lens? Well, what do you want to share with the world right now?
Yeah. Well, the way it works out, I think, is that most of my work, no matter what it's about, what its focus is, when I was doing it, most of my work is about what goes on in the space between people. And I think situations like this, a pandemic like this, and the various kinds of crisis that it enacts, disturbs, creates, it kind of illuminates things that are usually invisible going on in the space between people, the terrible thing, of course, is that it puts in jeopardy relationships that we take for granted. But the thing that becomes kind of possible in times like these is that it makes visible relationships that we take for granted and makes us conscious of those relationships, often because they're in jeopardy. And so I think about, all the people that we depend on, weekly or daily, the people that make our kids lunch at schools, the teachers, of course, in those schools, the bus drivers that get them to school, the people who are working in doctor's offices, dentist's office, and how life has been possible without these people, or at least life as we knew it or know it is impossible without them. And I think times like these where we have to think about our relationship to people like that and many others, as well as deal without those relationships on a temporary basis, we hope, makes their value to us and us to them clearer than it can often be, And so it kind of, in a long way of saying it, I think this is an opportunity for all of us to reassess our relationships to each other. And I hope, like in the future, insist that those relationships be right relationships, that I can live my life and the people who are making my life possible can also live their lives. That's the thing. And I think often, in the way our world usually works, those kinds of comings and goings are, like I say, taken for granted. They're invisible, and often they're not working in equitable fashion at all, to say the least. So, yeah.
Well, the power of what you might call monopolization and superstars and hero systems, etc., has dominated our discourse and what we call worship or cherish in economic commerce. But in fact, what you might say, the price and the value may be very different things. The value of these people, what you refer to as labor in the shadows, is really the essence. And right now it's been, particularly in the health realm, put on center stage to illustrate its importance and our underinvestment in those things which are, how would I say, there to support everyone.
That's right. Yeah, they make it all happen. And underinvestment's a mild way of putting it,
Oh, yeah.
So a tremendous amount of violence that goes that takes place in those relationships between, the capital that runs the world and the people that are actually doing the labor that makes the world run. It's
Yeah.
it's violence in all kinds of levels, and behind all that is actual violence. Because if
No, no,
you want to change those relationships, it's not too long before you're looking at a gun or police
that's right.
or the National Guard or whatever. So yeah, and beyond that, I mean, just in our daily lives, like I'm a person that's almost always in the world, looking for a closer relationship to the people around me, at work, in the street, at the gym, in family. That's what I want to do. I want to get close. I want to know how you're doing. I want to know what you're doing, how you're feeling, and want to know to what extent I can know. What is the quality of other people's lives, and in this, but at the same time, I often feel like, and sometimes people even tell me, in all kinds of ways, that not everybody feels that way. There are a lot of people that live their lives kind of in recoil from other people around them, in hiding from other people around them. Move to suburbs, move to gated communities, move to, the patterns in American life that disperse us from each other. Um, and I think that the social distancing thing now has again, made us all newly conscious of how all that works. Um, and for people like me, it's the first time I've ever felt, okay, am I too close to this person? You know what I mean? And for others, I think maybe in the life of a person who insists on a kind of distance from other people around them in whatever way, racial distance, class distance, just spatial distance, physical distance, emotional distance. I wonder if people who live with an insistence on those kinds of things, I wonder if this makes them more conscious of the costs of that, and how when it really happens to you, when people really can't come near you, um, maybe things aren't as great. Maybe a lot of people who think they live that way don't really live that way. You know what I mean? And so maybe this insistence now here that we have to, which of course we do have to do, to be conscious of our spatial proximity to each other, maybe that can cause some valuable reflection, in a lot of different kinds of people. But that won't happen unless there are voices to focus us on those kinds of things. Leaders who have these things in mind. And I'm not so sure that's all the time the case for our
Well,
for our
you're much more sensitive to language than I am, but I resent the phrase social distancing. I think it's physical distancing and using technology
right.
to deepen social connection.
There you go. Yes, yes. Even in the phrases, this stuff gets transmitted and amplified. When I first heard social distancing, I was like, well, damn, I thought we were socially distanced enough. And if we get any more socially distanced, we won't know anybody's out there at all. So, right.
Yeah. Well, Ed, one of the things that you've written and explored a lot in both your poetry and writing is is what you might call the combination of race and inequality.
Yeah.
And your uh, long poem at the start of your new book, All Along It Was a Fever, is, in my opinion, a masterpiece.
Well, thanks.
I remember it, I think it was titled because your daughter Suchi was singing a song by Rihanna,
That's right. It's
and that
called Stay. Hmm.
and that is a lyric from within.
That's, that's right.
But the way in which you explore what we might call otherness and the false consciousness and the way in which we decide on things like law enforcement and incarceration and professional hierarchies and access to health care, and how you wove that through your experience, how the arts move you, how your family experiences their identity, how you experience your identity,
That's
the
right.
tragedies that you experience in college. This is an amazing 40 so pages of a long poem. And the language is beautiful
Yeah.
because it takes you into that place that you referred to at the outset, that is closer
Yeah.
between people.
Yeah.
And the ugliness in some manifestations, and I think it was when you were in Wisconsin, there were a number of chapters that you bounce back and forth. It's kind of like you show us different acts in a mosaic, not linearly,
Right.
but but the patterns integrate so well. Does the pandemic? I mean, this book was finished before the pandemic became evident,
Oh, yes.
but when I see statistics like in Atlanta, they say that
Yeah.
80% of the people,
Yeah. In Georgia. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
oh, it's the whole state,
Oh,
okay,
mm-hmm.
80% of the people who have this are black.
Yeah. Who died from COVID
From
19 are black.
yeah,
That's right.
that's horrible.
Over 80%. I mean, you think about who has the opportunity to distance themselves from somebody else physically. Who has that many rooms in their house? Who has a single, who has a nuclear family? Who has a job that you can kind of go to via computer? And of course, all those things break down in class and racial terms. And in the South, class and race are so absolutely tightly intertwined, totally inextricably intertwined, that it doesn't surprise me that much, a statistic like that. At the same time, too, though, Robert, and I was thinking about this before, is that I do think that my inclination toward the presence of other people is about the way I was raised in Black cultural spaces and with Black families. I don't think I got that out of the blue. I don't think it was genetically encoded in me. I think that's something that's wired into Black culture and also wired into Black power. That Black power has come from collective endeavor in a very, very, very important way, in ways that most of American culture, in kind of standard mythological terms, doesn't really recognize. But in Black culture, it's very, very well recognized. And so to ask, people who are already, mainstream America, whatever you want to call folks, who are already physically and socially distanced from each other, to physically distance from each other is one thing. Okay, fine. We kind of been doing that already. But to ask Black folks, especially Black folks in the South, I think, to do that is really, I mean, that's calling up some really powerful patterns in the culture and families in personal, in the way people, move their bodies in the world every day, every minute, that need to be now readjusted and in some ways reversed. And even if people have the capacity, the space in their house, the room in their life to do this, there's a culture of togetherness,
Yes.
that needs to
Well,
be
just
refactored.
think about gospel music
Absolutely.
and the nature of the black churches. There's evidence there. My mother-in-law, my wife, as you know, is African American.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law is just, you know, how would I say? Thank God she's sophisticated with a computer and can attend church services electronically.
Yeah.
But it's not the same.
No.
It's not. It's not the fraternity, the camaraderie, the mutual support of that live interaction, and it's a big hole
Yes.
in a life
Yes.
that's been nourished by that, especially been nourished by that while hanging together and inspiring one another to collectively resist the oppression
Right.
that's weight hanging over them.
Because those collectives of people, bodies in the room, bodies in movement in space together, are responsible for the survival of Black people here. This is
Yes.
not like the cherry on top of the sundae. This is the whole thing. And so that's key. And when we see statistics like that, it's true that obviously poverty levels and employment levels and the way that careers and professional labor work out versus manual labor and so forth like that work out are responsible for that. But I think it's interesting to think about how this works culturally as well. I mean, I was at the playground, because they closed the Y, so I was on the basketball court outside again for the first time in a while. So I'm at the playground, and even up into mid and late March, I would try to go over there when there was nobody there, which was itself just a totally unprecedented thing in my life. I'm trying to find an empty basketball court. I would get there, and then some dudes would show up and they want to play, and I'd be like, man, we can't be doing this right now. And they were looking at me like I was crazy.
Yeah.
And so they finally had to close the parks and just put a lock on the thing because folks weren't going to do it. Um, and I remember, I wrote a couple friends of mine saying, yeah, man, like these dudes still were playing out there 5-on-5 in the middle of this thing. And I said, you think when we were 25 and someone told us we couldn't play basketball, because of this thing, you think we would have quit? They were like, hell no, we wouldn't have quit. So it's a lot, but statistics like that are shocking. And we need leaders to go into communities who can explain this to people. Say, yo, yeah, this is not the way we want to live. This is not where we come from. This is not who we are. But for these time, Mama, you got to watch the church online. You got to do it. We're doing the same thing with my mother-in-law a few weeks ago. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, and as you talked about, how would I say, music, I remember there was a passage in your poem about Miles Davis talking about how music becomes like it's part of your body.
right.
It's not the cerebral detached activity. I think he said that black artists came into his body in a way that
He said
that
that.
white music
He,
often did not do.
he said that when he was in an interview and talking about his childhood and how he used to listen to the radio. There was a bandstand show that would be right before he would have to go off to school in the morning. And he said, I listened to the radio for 15 minutes, before school every morning. I listened to these bands. And he stopped himself. And this was in the 80s. He stopped himself. He said, I mean, the black bands, the white bands wouldn't come into my body. And I just
Hmm.
thought it was such an interesting statement, yeah, yeah,
Well, I think there, how would I say, there are these different nature and structure of different sub communities within our society. As your poem builds out the kind of, as I call, otherness and the kind of cold legitimacy of otherness,
mm,
is something
hmm,
that one might, I don't mean it's legitimate, but the way in which people, what you might call, occlude their observation or curtail their consciousness to appear legitimate, which is probably a way of what you might call protecting oneself when afraid.
yeah,
Well, but the fear is heightened, and the pressures are great. The risk of despair is greater, and obviously, you can. I heard a wonderful saying in an argument the other day: "We're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same sea. People have different qualities of
right,
life raft,
right.
but but we're all being challenged."
That's for
And
sure.
the question, and one of the reasons, I mean, I knew I would call you to join me in this podcast because you've shared so many insights with me, and your awareness of, say, how Aretha Franklin changed her singing on the records related to Amazing Grace in relation to what she did with that black church community
Wow.
live. These kind of insights that you keep excavating
Yeah.
are extraordinary.
Yeah, and they're all related to the same thing, And well, in a way, they're all kind of linked. And that even Aretha, in those moments there in '72, between when she had those performances in January and when that album was released in the summer, um, even she, having performed in that embodied collective space of the church in live fashion with James Cleveland and the band and the choir and the audience or the church and her father, and just the way she was totally immersed, and she immersed in them, and they immersed in her voice.
Yes.
Everybody together, kind of flesh of each other's flesh. Even after that, to to have her go back to the studio in New York, and become a pop soul superstar again, outside the church, now in the studio in the secular space, and then reassert her own voice over and above all of that interrelation. It's just so moving to experience. It's confounding, but you understand it, because of course the market world is real, and Aretha was
Uh,
professionally ambitious just like everybody else is. And but
well, yeah,
to have such a clear example of, the self in communion on one hand and the self in kind of individual aspiration on the other hand, both performing like the identical music but in discernibly different ways. Just the difference between those recordings are as vivid an account of the kind of mechanisms of communion on one hand and say individuation on another as I as moving an account of that as I've ever run into. um and I was so surprised because I really didn't know that when I went into first listening to those different parts, those different recordings of that material. Of course, all of it instigated by the appearance of the great Amazing Grace film in 2018 or 19. I don't know, was it 18? Yeah.
yeah, 18
Yeah.
December. Yeah,
Well, I hadn't listened to all of that closely, but when I started to listen closely, the differences in those terms were so interesting and so moving and so, in some ways so disturbing. You know.
yeah. I
Uh,
remember the way you dissected for the Boston Review the song "Holy Holy," the
yeah.
Marvin Gaye song, and how it was transformed. But what we're really talking about here, generically, is the difference between art and the what you might call refractory commodification of art.
Yeah.
When you game the market, I remember my one man who was a mentor to me in my youngest days in Detroit, John Sinclair. He contributed with another writer to a volume called Music and Politics, and he said the difference between which you might call the rather violent, racially polarized community of Detroit and
Hmm.
the Quicksilver Messenger Service Jefferson Airplane world of San Francisco at the same time in the 60s
Yeah.
produced very different musics.
Yeah.
But he feared at that time, and said this consciously in the early 1970s, he feared that when people started composing music for a national or international market, the songs would be gaming the audience, not reflecting the conditions of life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And I think that uh, how would I say, Aretha was carrying a lot of responsibility.
yeah.
And when she re-recorded those vocals to be, say, perhaps less threatening to some of the audiences that were outside that church, she was probably, how I say, carrying a responsibility. I
Yeah.
don't think I don't think she was unmindful. I think she was quite aware and deliberate.
Very, very, yes, very aware. Aware in ways conscious and not conscious.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's just in the
Oh,
life of a performer like Aretha, just when you get into a certain space like a church, you will operate in a certain way whether you want to or not. Same with the studio. You know what I mean? They're just it's an atmosphere you enter. And she had given so much in all those different venues that there's almost a self waiting for her when she walks in. Then she occupies and plays out a version of herself. Really amazing. And this is true of all of us, but as with everything else, the way this plays out in the repertoire of one of the great genius performers, ever, makes these things more vivid and more incredible than they are just in our own kind of mundane and daily activities where we're doing these same things all the time. You know.
and those almost invisible forces, when they impact a great artistic performance,
Right.
make you shudder as
Yeah.
to how pervasive they are and how that correspondence we were talking about between the nature of work, between value and reward,
Right.
is quite haunting, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Now there's a we can bridge from Aretha, because when you and I first met, you had written this magnificent book around the life and consciousness and strategy of James Baldwin. And I remember very clearly that Baldwin, and you've described to me, envisioned himself in his correspondence with his family and so forth as having different, what I'll call modules of personality.
Sure.
But one of the things about Baldwin was he was very aware that that public, what I will call martial artist of the word, the stiletto debater,
Yeah.
began to feel that he could win the debate and lose on the change in the issue that were dear to his heart.
Yeah.
And you described in your book the song I Wonder from Aretha Arrives, and how he had an epiphany where I believe Baldwin said something to the effect that she speaks both to the people and the person at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he confided in other artists, in particular Ray Charles, and they conducted experiments about the relationship between poetics for healing and what you might call logic and debate.
Mm-hmm.
How did tell us a little bit about what you learned in how Baldwin transformed his strategy for making a difference?
Wow. I mean, Baldwin he had so many strategies and was out to make so many differences. It's
Yeah.
hard to put them down, but in the big picture, I think any reader who goes, you could pick any James Baldwin essay or any chapter of a novel and start reading it, and there's an intimacy in the address. There's a way that the way Baldwin is using language when you read it, just feels closer to you than it is when you read the language, with someone else working with it. Okay, where does that come from? Well, I think at the bottom it comes from Baldwin's experience in the church too, and with the music especially. As a young kid growing up in Harlem in a Pentecostal church, where you had people trying to create on a Wednesday night or a Sunday afternoon, they trying to recreate the sensation of being of one body. Trying to take people coming from all kinds of different places in their lives and rhythms of the day and put them in that room and bring them into one being. But Baldwin experienced that very, very, very intensely for the first 15 years of his life or so because of his family. And afterward, of course, he wasn't going to be he wasn't going to live his life as a preacher or a choir member. He wanted to be a writer. So in order to be a writer, he had to leave that world in very abruptly and in some ways go very far from that world to function. But I think at the same time, he needed the space clearly to work as a writer and to think and feel and move. But he also was with every phrase really trying to recreate that sense of connection. And the link between his work as a writer and his early, say, his early life with the experience of that connection in the church was music. Because it could operate in the life of a writer and in the life of the church. And so when he came across Aretha, when she started to sing, when he came across her work pretty much in the mid 60s, in the later 60s, 1967 or so, when she had started to record with Atlantic Records, he could hear, now here's a person doing like both what I want to do as a writer and also what those churches were there to do at the time. Now, between the time when Baldwin was in the church as a kid and Baldwin was as a writer in the 60s, you had the black church mobilizing the civil rights movement in, explicitly political fashion, which Baldwin was there to observe closely along the way. And so I think it makes a certain kind of structural sense how it is that he came to have such a great regard for Aretha, but not only Aretha, many, many other singers, the Edwin Hawkins singers, and that "Oh Happy Day" song. Baldwin took that song with him to Turkey and listened to it again and again and again. He told these guys at this underground, gay nightclub in Turkey, play it whenever I come in the club. They played it whenever he came in the club, and so he lived very close to that music, and it makes sense to me, both in his life, social life, but as well as in his work as a writer. And then Baldwin had a whole other career as a performer and a speaker as well, and he tried to to make that happen in those venues as well. Yeah. Ray Charles
Well,
along for all of that, of course, all along the way, even before, long before Aretha was in James Baldwin's mind or anybody else's. Ray Charles was out there doing it, kind of inventing the genre of soul in the mid '50s, and Baldwin and he got into connection with each other in the '60s and in the '70s, and actually performed, as you know, Robert. They performed together in the early 1970s, in the summer of 1973 in Carnegie Hall, which was quite quite an occasion that sadly was lost to history until I kind of uncovered it, which is interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And as I recall, Baldwin did a portion of this presentation as spoken word,
Yes,
and Ray Charles obviously did musical and lyrical metaphors around the same theme.
that's
And
right.
the reviewers criticized and were very hostile towards Baldwin and affirmed Ray Charles
Yeah,
using.
yeah. I thought the reviewer definitely, because of course the reviewers of that performance, which is called the Hallelujah Chorus, and it was part of the Newport Jazz Fest, which had venues in New York City that year as well. The reviewers were mainly music people, so they knew Ray Charles very well and respected him, and loved him very dearly in their own minds, especially. And Baldwin is someone they knew of, but who knows what they thought of James Baldwin. One thing that was clear about the reception of that performance was, however, that no musical reviewer had any taste for Baldwin's politics in connection to Ray Charles' music. They wanted people to understand these things as totally separate from each other. These guys were absolutely different. They came from different worlds. They had nothing in common. It was kind of a weird folly to put them on stage together in the first place. And Ray did great with the music, of course, because Ray's always going to do great with music, especially according to the music writers. But Baldwin's position there was regrettable, and the whole thing didn't work. In hindsight, clearly that's not in any objective way the case, or from other subjective points of view, absolutely not the case. But I think the way that performance was reviewed and read at the time was instructive, historically speaking, in that way.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I also remember, you talk about the sensitivity of Baldwin, and there was a book that you turned me on to. I think it was called Nothing Personal.
Yeah,
It involved Richard Avedon's photography.
right. And you had gone to high school with Baldwin.
I'm sorry, say again?
Baldwin and Richard Avedon were in high school together.
Ah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
they
I
had
do
known each other
remember
since
that.
they were kids.
And but there was this tenderness, this depth that you have alluded to in Baldwin, where he's talking about in a time of great anxiety and great despair, not unlike what many of us are living now, that kind of you realize that you won't be there forever.
Yeah,
And he says sometimes at 4 a.m., this knowledge is almost enough to force a reconciliation between oneself and all one's pain and error.
mm,
Since anyway, it will end one day, why not try it, life, one more time?
yeah,
And as I look at where the world sits now, many of the crutches, many of the false consciousness elements and rules and modes of behavior are in tatters. They've been unmasked as inadequate
yeah,
by the pandemic.
right.
And that creates kind of a void, that creates a very, very anxious time, not unlike Baldwin's description of 4 a.m.
Yeah,
But it's his poetics, in my view, It's that insight about reaching the heart. It's the insights that you say that come from the church in his formative years, where I think there are clues to the kind of healing and restructuring of society that we must embark on at
Yeah.
this juncture. We
Yeah.
face daunting challenges of hostility across nations.
Oh my.
I'm reading today about all the penalties that Donald Trump says he wants to inflict on the Chinese. And you can see the Indians in India
Mm-hmm.
worrying about their ability to handle health and development and energy transformation. And given the size, they're almost 20% of the world's population.
Right.
A We all on Earth benefit from a transformation of energy in India. And to say it's not our problem as wealthy economies, it's their problem,
Yeah.
when we will benefit from them, which you might call retarding their pure economic development to be responsible with regard to carbon emissions.
Yes.
We've got so much coordination and so much challenge to do. I To me, I mean, Baldwin's sense of the poetic, speaking to the people and the person,
Yeah.
touching the heart, it's just got to play a role.
Yeah.
We're not. I mean, you're a poet, so I'm speaking to the converted. But
Yeah.
working papers and statistics have their place, but that's not all that we need in the storytelling that allows us to rise to this occasion.
True. And where is that sense of each other going to come from? It come from the artist. Has to. Has
Well,
to.
and some of the clues I think are in work that you've shared with me that you haven't yet published
Uh-huh.
about how Baldwin fortified himself to go into the dungeon of creativity and find the inspiration, and how much he depended upon the nourishment of others, family,
Yeah.
friends, professional communities,
Yeah.
in the different aspects of his, how would I say, composite personality. But it was all about where does the creativity, where does the courage, where does the insight come from? And it involved interpersonal
That's right.
interaction,
That's
like you focused on in your new book,
yes.
like you focus on in your life's work, I should
Yeah, yeah. I
say.
mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, consider it this way, Robert. Like, not only where does it come from, but where does it go to? Like, imagine if you had to, if you had, imagine if you had to create a picture of yourself, but you could only use things that other people would say about you. You know, introspection was off the table. What you think about yourself is meaningless. The only thing important is the sense of yourself that you could gain from other people in the world. How
Yes.
different would our actions be if just personally, as well as professionally in our lives and in our work? How different would our how different would how we expend our energy be if we were trying to author ourselves in the eyes of other people in a way that we could tolerate, in a way that we could respect? And Baldwin, that's kind of what he was in a way out to do. He understood that what he thought about himself was besides the point. It was what other people thought. Not that he wanted to, conform to the vision of other people, but that he wanted to author that sense of himself in the world by works. And that's what teachers do, and that's what nurses do, and that's what bus drivers do. That's what carpenters do. That's what a pizza maker does. And that's to say that that it's very healthy to think of ourselves as real, primarily or at least fundamentally as a result of our relations to other people and how those go, you know, rather than
Hmm.
run away from all that into some burrow where every night we retell the story to ourselves in a way that makes us the hero and says everybody else is wrong and so forth and so on, you know? Um, and again, that's the kind of labor that we depend on every day, and times like this make us very conscious of that dependence.
Well, Ed, you know I have a large group called the Young Scholars Initiative.
Right.
We're about 11,000 strong in terms of membership now. And one of the things that I try to impart to them is that when you're on this path of trying to create a purposeful and meaningful life, introspection plays an enormous role because you have to go into yourself critically and understand your own neediness. Because if you don't, you're kind of bandied about trying to get in, metaphorically, in front of parades that other people are running.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you can detach yourself, and I don't mean eliminate, but detach yourself so that you can understand your needs, it may free you to define your purpose and come back and not be pulled off course
Hmm.
and be able to stick to your resolve and realize that purpose and have a more satisfying life.
Right. No, no, you need both. You need both. Uh,
Yeah.
but too often, I think, do we think of the creative art or the work of the artist as this solitary, detached, secluded, isolated endeavor, and certainly privacy and solitude have their roles, but they're not the only thing. And I
That's
think
right.
often we have a sense of a creative life that, or even a successful life or an enjoyable life, which can be, I don't know, overdetermined by solitude. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, and
Well, and there's a false consciousness in pretending to solitude.
yes,
I'll take this back to economics. Pretending you're a dispassionate, objective scientist when you exist in the context of peer-reviewed journals,
right, yeah,
promotions, government positions, consulting contracts, prestige,
right,
tenure. They, uh, I can't remember, H.L. Mencken, I think in 1922, wrote this essay called The Dismal Science.
yeah,
And he started by saying, the only people I trust less than theologians might be economists, because when they think, they are not free.
right,
And what he meant by that was when they think, they understand how powerful people will react. And so they're not free to take what you might call the other side of the argument,
right,
and that perhaps unconsciously they are shaped in the direction of affirming power,
right,
securing their position in front of trustees and tenure committees and what
right.
have you,
Sure.
and that this refracts the public good nature of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a time where what you might call the credibility, faith, and trust in the integrity of expertise appears to be in tatters.
That's true.
And it's exploited by fake news. But watch the president of the United States go after experts. And I'm not saying it's all healthy. I think we need expertise. But when expertise ceases to be for the public good
Right.
and starts to have a private agenda, like a magnetic field pulling it off course, it becomes compromised, and people are right to be skeptical
That's
or
right.
suspicious. So that, uh, how would I say, you could see people becoming an economist, getting involved in conformity, missing the punchline entirely, and now looking at in tatters at where we are. And I'm not saying that economists caused the pandemic, but it's like you said at the outset, a whole lot of things that are now revealed to matter an awful
Right.
lot weren't valued very highly
Right.
before this time.
Yep. Yep. We're seeing it now.
But we're not just in the business of diagnosis and criticism. We've got to be in the embrace the task of filling the void with that future
Yeah.
that what you might call we might be more proud to hand to our children than what was on the platter as of Christmas time last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
But James Baldwin is a beacon of how to struggle, and I think you are the person, at least in my mind, who in addition to his own work, has interpreted
Yeah.
that beacon in a way that's helped me greatly to understand.
Me too. Me too. That's the effort. Yeah.
So they, as I think you once called one of your drafts you shared with me, there's no time to rest.
No time to rest.
And yet I haven't seen you rest since I've known you.
Well,
You've been prolific, and you just keep on going.
yeah.
What would you tell young people today of any discipline? What comes to your mind? What advice would you share with them about their, how we say, the mission that they will be on in their life
Yeah.
going forward?
Figure out the challenge for me was to figure out the way, like what is there to do in the world that allows you to be in the relationship to people that you want to be in? What can you do for people? Um, what do you want to be around people doing, and where in the world does that become possible? Because I think at the end of the day, if you're not involved in relationships with people that are worthwhile, that are worth struggling for, it doesn't. Not that it always makes you feel good, but something you can, at 4 a.m. in the morning, like Baldwin is saying, you can kind of face what you're about, and what you're about is measured in the way you relate to other people. That's the challenge, because this world is kind of never sleeps in its efforts to put us at odds with each other and to make us, salesmen for somebody else's interests, and make other people our victims in those arrangements. So the great challenge is how to be, how to situate one's life and one's work in such a way that one can do some good for people. And then the people involved in the lines of work that do good for other people, they need to be in contact with each other so that they can make what they do and its value known to the world. You know, I was talking to a student a few months ago in my office, and she was like, "Well, I want to be a teacher." I was like, "Well, where do you want to work?" She's like, "I don't know." It's like, "Well, have you looked into like what cities, what states have teachers unions?" She had never even thought of this, and it's important because part of the work is about doing the work, and part of it is about advocating for the work you do, which is also the work other people are doing. And so I think it's always that it's always both those things going on at the same time.
Well, I'm going to crib from your poem to bring us to a conclusion, because you articulate and sample Baldwin in 1968. Because people are always in great danger when they know what they should do and refuse to act upon the knowledge. there's a call to action. But as I listen to you today in many days and read your work, it's this it's Adriana Rich, who I believe was a very big influence in your life,
Yeah,
who
yes,
said there must be ways, and we will be finding out more about them, in which the energy of creation and the energy of relation can be united.
absolutely.
That comes pretty close
That's what it's all about, right?
to how I understand Ed Pavlic.
Absolutely.
And I will say to you in a personal tribute, as you know, because we were at the Aspen Ideals Festival last year together and talked about this.
Yeah.
My dearest friend of 47 years had passed away on December 1st, 2018. And he used to hang around in Aspen, had a bakery there for some time. His name was Rob Kayberry.
Hmm.
And when the void opened up in my life, and I've got lots of good friends and family, but the void of the everyday conversation I had with him and learning from, he was a baker,
Yeah.
but very, very, very powerful, artistic, and sophisticated politically. When that void opened up, probably the person I would say as of right now who has most helped me fill that void and missing him is you.
Oh man. Yeah. Well, I've been there. I know how that is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you just, how would I say, you got so much to say, and it's nice that you would come and join me and share it with us today.
No, it was a pleasure, man.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely love to do it.
We'll do it again soon.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm looking forward to it.
Bye bye.
Great.
And check out more from the Institute for New Economic Thinking at ineteconomics.org.